Hello and welcome to the Legal Edition. I'm your host, Attorney Mary Kay Elloian. Our guest today is Glenn A. Fine, author of Watchdogs, Inspectors General and the Battle for Honest and Accountable Government. Glenn is a former Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Justice under Presidents Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama, and acting Inspector General of the Department of Defense under Trump. He led a number of high-profile ethics investigations on national security issues, from 9/11 to U.S. spies and the wars overseas. He speaks candidly about the need for honest and accountable government, including the U.S. Supreme Court. He also details the Friday night massacre of Inspector Generals under Donald Trump. Let's welcome former Inspector General Glenn A. Fine. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you wrote the book Watchdogs. What made you write this book?
So I think inspectors general are some of the most important public servants you've never heard of. I wanted to write this book for a variety of reasons. I wanted to expose more citizens to the crucial role they play in protecting our democracy and providing a critical check and balance on government. I wanted to encourage people, students who study government, to learn about them and perhaps encourage some of them to go into either the inspector general community or public service. I wanted to write it for the vast number of employees in the federal inspector general community, as well as the state and local inspector general community. And I wanted taxpayers to know that there's a check and balance on our government, a watchdog that's making transparent how their money is being spent. So I wanted to expose more people to their crucial role.
Now, what are some of the key issues that you had to deal with over your tenure? You were both a IG of the Justice Department and then later the Department of Defense. Let's start with the Department of Justice, your role there. What were some of the key issues you had to deal with?
So I was the Inspector General for the Department of Justice from 2000 to 2011. That was before and after the September 11th attacks. So that was a critical and tumultuous time in the department. The department changed its priorities, so the Inspector General's office had to change its oversight and its priorities. We did a fair number of investigations about the 9/11 attacks, whether there were missed opportunities to deter the attacks, the treatment of detainees after the attacks, the handling of immigration and naturalization visas for some of the hijackers. So that was a challenging time. It's a challenging time to be an IG at any time, really. You have to be independent. You have to bring bad news to government leaders sometimes. You have to speak truth to power. That does not always make you the most popular person in the agency, but you have to be tough but fair. That's what we tried to do with our reports at the Department of Justice and at the Department of Defense when I was there. And that is a challenge.
I think it's a challenge with any presidency. But with 9/11, can you outline some of the issues that you did have to deal with? Some of the, whether it be prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, and can you give us a synopsis of that?
Sure, I'll talk about a couple investigations. One investigation we did was pursuant to the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act gave the FBI and the Department of Justice more responsibilities and authority, but it also gave my office the responsibility to receive and review civil rights and civil liberties complaints and report on them. After the 9/11 attacks, the FBI launched an intensive investigation to prevent future attacks, but also determine who had conducted the attacks. It was called PENFOM. And as part of that investigation, they detained over 700 undocumented immigrants who they encountered pursuant to their investigation. Most of them were held in the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. We started receiving complaints that they were mistreated there, that they were physically and verbally abused. They weren't given access to counsel. They weren't allowed to sleep at night. It was some serious allegations. So we decided to open a wide-ranging review of how these undocumented immigrants, mostly Muslims and Arabs who were encountered pursuant to the investigation, were treated. And we found abuses. We found that these allegations were true. They were physically and verbally abused. They didn't have access to counsel. They were told, some of them were told, you're going to die here. we thought it was important for the Department of Justice and the IG's office to ensure that they were treated in accord with our values and with the rules and regulations, even in a time of crisis, even in a tumultuous time. So we issued a very comprehensive report on that. Initially got criticized by some for saying we were hurting the war on terror. I rejected that. I thought that we could both, as a country, effectively have a counterterrorism policy, but also make sure that we were treating individuals according to the law and the principles that guide our country. So that was a very sensitive report, and it got a lot of attention.
And many of those people were innocent, were they not?
There was only one of those people was ever charged with a terrorism charge. Now, to be clear, they had committed. They were many of them were in the country without permission. They were undocumented, but they should have been treated the way others were treated as well, and they should not have been physically and verbally abused. So that was clear.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you also do any other investigations with 9/11 with regards to any other aspect of it?
Yes, we did a review of how the FBI interacted with detainees in military facilities, including at Guantanamo, and whether they had participated in any what was called enhanced interrogation techniques, others called it torture, and what their role in it was. We all remember the shocking photos of Abu Ghraib and the mistreatment of detainees. So we have jurisdiction over the FBI. We don't have jurisdiction as the IG of the Justice Department over the CIA, the Department of Defense. But we thought it was important to determine what the FBI's role was in these interrogations. We determined that they abided by the FBI policies, that by and large they did not participate in any abusive treatment of detainees, and we reported that. That's one of the values of an inspector general, an independent inspector general. When an IG clears an agency, it has more credibility than if the agency itself investigated and said we didn't do anything wrong. So the reaction to that report was to say the FBI should be credited for how it handled itself with regard to these detainees and these abusive actions. So I think that is another indicator of the value of a tough but fair inspector general who's not afraid to criticize the FBI when warranted or the agency when warranted, but is also not afraid to clear the agency when warranted, when that's what the facts and evidence showed. So that was the benefit of that report as well.
Now, what about, did you issue reports upon the FBI not synthesizing the information that they had that could have warned them about 9/11?
That was another report we did. We looked at the information the FBI had before 9/11 that could have given them indications of the attack. So yes, we did find that there was indications and things that they could have done better, that there were missed opportunities to put the dots together. For example, the Moussaoui case, Zacharias Moussaoui, was detained before the 9/11 attacks, and the Minneapolis FBI office wanted to search his computer. The headquarters felt there wasn't adequate predicate, so even though he was very suspicious actions in flight training, the FBI in Minneapolis was never able to search his computer and never found what was on it. Now, it wasn't clear whether he was the so-called 20th hijacker, but he was involved with some of the terrorists. And so we looked at that and found that they could have done better. There was other indicators that they could have followed up on. What was called the Phoenix Memorandum. An FBI agent in Phoenix, raised concerns about foreign students trying to learn aviation techniques, perhaps in an effort to use it for attacks, but that was never really synthesized or looked at carefully before the attack. So that was another one that we found problematic. So there was a series of indicators. And there was also information that the FBI and the CIA did not share. There was a wall between them and they were not sharing information. So two of the hijackers were in touch with a known terrorist, and that was not shared among the FBI and the CIA. And by the time it was just a few days before the attack. The FBI didn't, with much sense of urgency, look for those two hijackers and never found them. So there was a series of missed opportunities that we talked about. But one of the most important things of an inspector general is not simply to point out problems, but to make recommendations for improvement. And that's what we tried to do in all of these reports.
And did they make changes after your recommendations?
They did make changes. They made changes in how information was shared relating to the wall, as well as others as well. Now, they don't have to implement our recommendations. but they do have to respond to them. And they did respond with agreement to almost all of them. And one of our jobs is to follow up to make sure that they actually implement them. And that's what we saw happen with those reports and others.
Mhm. I'm sure there were congressional hearings on all of these issues as well.
There was a series of congressional hearings. One of the roles of an IG is report problems not only to the agency head, but also to Congress. The Inspector General has a dual reporting responsibility to keep both currently informed of the deficiencies and problems. And we did, and we do, and IG still do that. When I was the IG of the Justice Department and also the IG of the Department of Defense, I testified 55 times before congressional committees. They have a positive impact because when a congressional committee shines a spotlight on an IG report and a problem, often you see a sense of urgency from the department about fixing it in light of a congressional hearing. So I often would see a little bit of slow walking on some of the needed corrective actions. When a congressional hearing was scheduled, the pace picked up. So both the spotlight that an IG can provide on a problem and also the spotlight that a congressional hearing can provide on a problem has a salutary impact on the agency.
Well, it sounds like it's desperately needed. Agencies need to talk to one another, and there needs to be better communication to prevent another tragedy like 9/11.
I think that's right. I think there has been better communication, but one has to always remain vigilant. And with new people, with time passing, sometimes you see similar problems. And an IG and the agency also has to maintain vigilance and persistence to solve the problems and make sure there's not backsliding.
And be independent and remain independent.
Well, that's the cornerstone principle for an inspector general. You have to remain independent. Independence is the corner of the realm for an IG. If you don't have that, you cannot have credibility. You will not have an impact. I mean, I'll tell you a story about that. I was the IG of the Justice Department and worked with 5 attorney generals. When I was the acting IG of the Department of Defense, worked with 4 secretaries of defense. Not all of them understood the independent role of the IG under the Inspector General Act, that we were within the department, but that we were unique. We could not be told what to do. We had to determine ourselves what to do, and they could not interfere with us. And I would brief each attorney general, for example, when they came into office, telling them about our independence, telling them how we operated. And I remember the reaction, and not all of them understood the role of the IG and weren't familiar with it. So I remember the reaction of one of them after I told him how independent we were and we decided what to do. He looked at me intently and he said, "So you're telling me that I can order around everyone else in this building, the main justice building, and tell them what to do, tell them what to investigate, what to audit, but I can't tell you?" And I looked at him and I said, "Yes, that is what I'm telling you. That is what the Inspector General Act requires." So he stared at me intently, and then he said, "Okay, if that's what the law is, we follow the law around here." And he did, as did the others. And I was very fortunate that eventually they understood the role of the IG. They appreciated the role of the IG, although they didn't always appreciate the reports. Sometimes they received them with gritted teeth, but they never interfered. I think they valued the impact that we could have in improving department operations.
Now, just getting back to your role as IG of the Justice Department for one moment, you had to investigate the Hansen case. Can you talk a little bit about that case?
Sure. Robert Hansen was the most damaging spy in FBI history. He spied for the Russians and the Soviets for over 2 decades without being detected. He compromised some of our most important intelligence assets. As a result of his espionage, some of our assets were executed by the Russians. When he was eventually uncovered and captured in 2001, the FBI said, well, the reason that he was able to evade detection for so long was because he was an intelligence analyst, and he used his tradecraft and was very crafty and wily and evaded detection.
Isn't that what was said about Snowden?
A little less so with Snowden, but for Hansen, he was a counterintelligence agent. But what we were asked to look at it to determine why it was that he was able to evade detection. And we determined that the FBI's answer that he was so wily and crafty and the master spy was nothing could have been further from the truth. He was a mediocre agent. He was reckless in his spying. He did things that raised red flags that were never followed up on. The FBI had a incredibly weak internal security program, did not give him a polygraph. He was not required to do a financial disclosure. He was given one perfunctory background investigation over 20 years. We determined that, for example, he hacked into the FBI computer systems, and when it was found out, he said, well, I was doing this to show that the FBI computer systems were weak, and they blithely accepted that. He was a problem employee, and they sent him up because they didn't want to deal with him. They sent him over to the State Department on a detail, and nobody supervised him. He was reckless. He deposited tons of money that he received from the Soviets and Russians in a bank account a block away from the FBI. He brought with him a stripper on an inspection tour in a foreign country, and nobody complained about it. Nobody followed up on all this derogatory information.
That's unbelievable.
It was unbelievable. It was unbelievable. And what it showed was that the FBI's internal security practice was based on trust. They trusted their agents wouldn't be spies. Trust is not a good internal security practice. So we made a series of recommendations to improve that. The FBI did some of them, resisted a few. And again, a congressional hearing was held where I testified, and the Congress pressed the FBI. They eventually agreed to implement all the recommendations. And we followed up that they had implemented, by and large, those recommendations. But what this case showed is that the value of an independent inspector general. The FBI basically was saying, nothing to see here. We have it covered. But it's hard for an agency itself to investigate itself. It's hard for an agency to admit embarrassing information. That's why you need an outside independent investigator like an IG, not within the agency, but not part of agency control, to be tough but fair and to point out the problems and recommend solutions. And that's what the Hansen case, in my view, showed: the value of an inspector general to make improvements in an agency that may not want to do it itself.
Now, as far this happened, I believe he was caught in the early 2000s, I believe.
2001.
And he's now deceased.
Yes, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As part of that, he had to cooperate with investigators, including our office. We interviewed him. I interviewed him with our team, and he was a strange individual, minimized the damage that he caused, but basically said that if there was a greater deterrence by the FBI, I wouldn't have done it. I would not have done it. Now, I don't know if that's 100% true, but I do believe that if there was greater deterrence, it would have prevented it from happening for so long, and it may have deterred him. He eventually was incarcerated in the administrative max, the highest security prison in Florence, Colorado, along with other very high profile prisoners: Ramzi Youssef, El Chapo, Guzman, the Unabomber. And that's where he was, in that very high security prison for the rest of his life, and died in prison last year.
What was sad is he compromised a lot of people, and people were executed because of his spying.
Yes, they were people who had risked their lives to provide information to the United States, and he exposed them, and they were executed. Absolutely.
By the Russians.
By the Russians.
Okay, now let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about your time as acting IG of the Defense Department. Can you talk about some of your high-profile investigations there?
Sure. So I was the acting inspector general of the Department of Defense from 2016 to 2020. It's a big operation. It's the largest IG's office in the government, and that's understandable because we had oversight over the entire Department of Defense, which is the largest organization in the government. In fact, it's the largest organization in the world. And so we had jurisdiction over the entire operations of the Department of Defense. In terms of high-profile investigations, I guess I can point to one. It's called the so-called Fat Leonard case. Leonard Glenn Francis ran a ship servicing company in Asia, and he supplied ships with supplies, water, sewage removal, tugboat service, a whole series of services that you need in port. But what he did was he compromised those officers by bribing them, first with small gifts, then with large gifts, then with cash, then with prostitutes and fancy dinners. And he infiltrated pretty much many officers in the 7th Fleet in the Pacific to both provide him information, sometimes classified information about ship schedules, to overlook excessive bills. He would bill the government for, let's say, water that exceeded the capacity of the ship's tanks. And because he had bribed and compromised these officers, it was paid. Hundreds of officers came under his spell. Talk about an intelligence agent. He was like an intelligence agent. He knew what your weakness was, and he would exploit that weakness. He would put the bait out there, whether it was small gifts, whether it was dinners, whether it was tickets, and then he would, once he had you on the hook, he would give you more, and then he would demand something in return. It was the largest corruption scandal in Navy history, implicating hundreds of officers in the Seventh Fleet, up to including admirals. Ultimately, 33 of them were convicted of criminal offenses, and hundreds of them received administrative censures, some of which ended their career. So it was a challenging investigation for our office, and we worked with the U.S. Attorney's Office, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, ultimately brought him to justice and brought many cases against individuals. There's a postscript to the story. After he was cooperating with the government, after the trials were over and he was about to be sentenced, he absconded. He was under house arrest. He cut off his ankle bracelet. He drove into Mexico, flew to Cuba, then to Venezuela, and was on the way to Russia when he was detained by the Venezuelans and imprisoned there. Ultimately, the United States government swapped a Venezuelan prisoner with the Venezuelans, and he was returned, extradited to the United States in a prisoner swap. And now he's in a federal prison in California and will be sentenced. So it's an amazing story. I tell this story in the book, in a chapter of
Yes,
the book.
it is amazing.
It was it was a stain on the Navy, on the honor of the Navy, but we were able to, along with Naval Criminal Investigative Service and the U.S. Attorney's Office, uncover that plot.
And throughout all your investigations, you always make recommendations so that hopefully these types of things will be prevented. Is that correct?
We do make recommendations, particularly in audits and evaluations and in some of the special investigations. When it's a criminal case, like in the Fat Leonard case, we basically work with the prosecutors to bring the criminal case. But yes, we also make recommendations to prevent these things from happening. And that's the value of an IG, to not only point out problems, but also to point out solutions.
Now, let's talk a little bit about you. In your book, you talk about the Friday night massacres of IGs. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, so in a short period of time, President Trump removed or tried to remove 5 IGs, which was unusual. It wasn't illegal, but the norm is that IGs are nonpartisan and remain. They remain when administrations change, and they normally remain during the tenure of a president, unless they're really, not doing their jobs in any effective manner. But what happened was, I'll tell my story, and then I'll tell the other stories as well. I was the acting inspector general of the Department of Defense for 4 years. Then COVID hit. Congress appropriated trillions of dollars in COVID relief funds. But as part of that package, there had to be a committee of inspectors general to deter abuse and fraud in those funds and investigate problems. One of the IGs had to be selected as the chair of the committee. I drew the short straw. I was selected by my colleagues in the IG community to be the chair of the committee to oversee the COVID funds. President Trump, who had famously said, "We don't need oversight," he said, "I will be the oversight," he said. Within 5 days of my being selected as the chair, removed me as the acting IG of the Department of Defense, meaning I couldn't be on the committee or chair the committee, and I was no longer the head of the office of the Office of the Inspector General of the Department of Defense. He appointed somebody who was recently confirmed as the EPA IG to also, at the same time, be the acting IG of the Department of Defense, to sort of run 2 IG offices, which in my view is virtually impossible. It's hard enough to run 1, but to run 2 is impossible. So that was it. My tenure as the acting IG of the Department of Defense was over. Around the same time, he removed 4, or tried to remove 4 others, including Michael Atkinson, the intelligence community IG, who had brought forward the Ukraine whistleblower matter, which had led to President Trump's first impeachment. He removed Steve Linick, the State Department IG, who was investigating serious allegations of misconduct within the State Department. He removed the Department of Transportation acting IG. He tried to remove the HHS IG. The Washington Post labeled these removals the slow motion Friday night massacre of inspectors general, because they were normally announced late on a Friday night. So that's what happened. And It was unusual. And it sent, to be honest, sent chills down the IG community of who was going to be removed next. No others were removed, but it was a challenging time for IGs.
What I found interesting was the timing. It was in his last few months of, I think was it April of his last term in office, his
Yeah, it was
last year.
started in April of 2020, April and May, I think in June of 2020, and that was the last year of his tenure. Yeah.
Because normally if you're going to remove an IG, wouldn't you start in your first year?
Well, I would hope you wouldn't start then either, but the historical practice is that because IGs are nonpartisan, they remain every other presidential appointee. And IGs are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, but they have to be selected for nonpartisan qualifications. And the historical practice was that IGs remain and don't submit their resignations when other presidential appointees do. So that's why, for example, I served in the Department of Justice under 3 different presidential administrations: Clinton administration, Bush administration, Obama administration. I left in 2011 because 11 years was long enough. Change is good for an individual and an organization. So I stepped down and worked at a big law firm. And while it was interesting, it didn't have the same satisfaction for me. So I also think I'm a recidivist. And I went back to the government in the Department of Defense and served under 2 presidents, Obama and Trump. So that's the historical practice, and that wasn't adhered to by President Trump in 2020.
Is it true that Steve Linick was investigating Mike Pompeo at the time, who was also Secretary of the State?
Yep. Yes, he had investigations ongoing against Secretary Pompeo. Secretary Pompeo said that that's not why he was removed, but those investigations were ongoing.
And you were never told why you were removed?
Never given a reason why. I can guess why, and that's all it is, speculation. But when I found out, nobody ever contacted me. I was never contacted by the White House or even the Department of Defense. I heard about it from another IG, Michael Horowitz, the chair of the Council of Inspectors General. I then asked to see the paperwork, had the council see the paperwork, and yep, I saw a 1-page document replacing me as the IG and with President Trump's signature at the bottom. Never told why.
Is it true that IG Atkinson had consulted about the whistleblower with several IGs, and were those IGs let go?
So he had consulted with several IGs, and I was one of them. We talked about how to handle that, and in fact, the entire IG community supported how he handled that.
The whistleblower.
How he handled the whistleblower disclosure under the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Act. If it's an urgent concern, he is required to provide it to the Director of National Intelligence, who's required to provide it to Congress, and that didn't happen. We supported the way he handled it. We thought it was by the book and under the law, and he was fired as a result of that.
And that was regarding the Ukraine investigation.
Yes.
And let's shift gears one more time. Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court.
Our Supreme Court.
Yes. Now, they recently adopted a code of conduct recently, but I don't think it has much teeth. Do you want to talk about what's really needed here?
Yes, I have written articles, and it's in the book, talking about the need for an enforcement mechanism, and that all organizations need oversight. Most resist it. Department of Justice resisted oversight initially when the Inspector General Act was passed in 1978. It said, well, we don't need one because we are lawyers. That argument didn't age that well. Department of Defense resisted it, saying we have military IGs, but eventually there was an IG there. FBI resisted it. Now the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary is resisting oversight. All organizations need oversight, and the judiciary does too, for a variety of reasons. One, the judiciary is a huge operation. It has 30,000 employees. It has a $8 billion budget. It runs courthouse security, information technology security, probation, parole. There's going to be problems in an organization like that. You need an effective internal investigator, auditor to find problems, to expose weaknesses, to make recommendations. So the judiciary would benefit from an IG like others do as well. In addition, there are allegations of misconduct that are inevitably going to happen. There have been allegations against Supreme Court justices. There is no credible internal mechanism to investigate that. Basically, we rely on the justices to respond or not to respond, to say there's nothing to see here. What other agency has that? Where in federal agencies, you don't go to the subject and say, well, you respond and just leave it at that. We need an internal investigator, professional, credible, nonpartisan, independent, to at least determine the facts, to make transparent. So we're not debating this in the press and have, reporters track down information and the justice respond. It's not. It reduces trust in the court. Trust in the Supreme Court has reached an all-time low. I think it's for a variety of reasons, one of which is there are controversies about the decisions. People have differences about the recent decisions, but also because there's no way to investigate these serious allegations of ethical conduct in a way that people understand the facts and make transparent what happened. I believe that the Supreme Court and the judiciary would benefit from an IG to at least determine what the facts are. Now, the IG would not be responsible for discipline or making recommendations on recusal, and certainly wouldn't be involved in investigating judicial decision making. But there should be a way to investigate ethical allegations of impropriety. It would benefit the court and the judiciary and benefit everyone to have such an office.
It's very troubling when you hear that Clarence Thomas has taken, extravagant gifts and trips and from billionaires. I mean, Hansen was taking it. We saw what happened with him. I mean, I'm very worried about the legitimacy of the court. And I'm also very worried about their independence because they've been accepting gifts. Do you have anything to say about, how you see that playing out?
Yeah, so I don't really want to comment on the substance of the allegations other than to say they need a credible investigation so that we all know what happened. We read about it in the newspaper. Did it happen that way? Some of the justices respond no, or it wasn't a problem. I think that we need to have a way to determine the facts of the case so that we're all working on the same page, so that the American people know what happened here, and also so the Congress knows as well, and also so the other justices know. We shouldn't leave it to each justice to police themselves. That violates a fundamental precept in our law, which is no one should be a judge of his or her own case. So we ought to at least have a way to investigate serious problems. I'll give you another example. Everyone acknowledge, including the Chief Justice, that the leak of the draft opinions of the Dobbs case was an egregious abuse of trust and it needed an investigation. So he assigned it to the Marshal of the Court. But the Marshal of the Court is not an independent professional investigator, didn't have the independence, the experience, the expertise to investigate this very serious allegation. And as a result, the investigation was limited and flawed. I've written articles about that. It's referred to in the book. I think even that would benefit from a professional, permanent, independent investigator who could investigate the facts in a credible way. That's an example, and there are many other examples as well. There are going to be more allegations. It's just inevitable. It's human nature. And we need a way to determine what happened. That's why the court and the American people would benefit from an inspector general.
And federal judges themselves have a code of conduct and ethical rules that they have to abide by, but not so for the U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, the court does now have a code of conduct. It adopted a code recently amidst some pressure. As it said in the preamble that it was a compilation of what they already adhered to, but at least it was a written code. There's some gaps and things like that, but it was a step forward, but only a step. There needs to be a way a mechanism to enforce it, and also to ensure that we understand what the facts are and that the justices don't police themselves.
Yeah, self-policing does not work. Do you have any final comments about either how to rectify that issue or any of the other things that we've discussed today?
So I will say there are several ways about it. Enforcement mechanism for the court. I believe Congress can do it constitutionally. It can regulate the court. It sets its jurisdiction. It sets its salaries. It sets rules regarding financial disclosure. I think that it has the authority to do that. Although some say it's unconstitutional, violates the separation of powers. And who would decide that? The court itself. So that would be problematic. In my view, a better solution would be for the court itself to adopt an enforcement mechanism like an inspector general, reporting perhaps to the Chief Justice or the head of the administrative office of the United States courts. So I think that would be a solution, and a positive solution for them to adopt that mechanism and recommendation, so that we have a way to police the court in a more trustworthy way.
Mm-hmm. And Article 3 of the Constitution says that they get to keep their job during good behavior. And my question is, what constitutes good behavior? You know, taking money from other people or taking bribes, what appears to be bribes or whatever.
Yeah, I wouldn't go that far and say that, I would say it's a bribe. What I would say is we need a way to expose the facts, what they are, so that we don't know for sure.
Exactly.
And we need to have a better understanding of what happened, and then people can make their own judgments.
Exactly. Well, it's been a pleasure having you today. I've enjoyed this conversation. Hope you do too. And your book is Watchdogs, Inspectors General and the Battle for Honest and Accountable Government. Thank you again for your diligence and for your service to this country and for your book. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Pleasure talking to you.
Same here. I want to thank our guest, Glenn A. Fine, for sharing his insights and information on his role as Inspector General and what it means for an ethical and accountable government. I also want to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. For more information on today's topic and our guest, visit us online at thelegaledition.com. As always, this information is for general educational purposes only, is not to be construed or relied upon as legal or personal advice. So please consult a qualified practitioner as to your own legal or personal needs. And don't forget, subscribe online. Find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Twitter, now X. And subscribe to our publication on Substack.